A warm welcome to all our viewers. I'm Anjali from Simplilearn, and today I'll be taking you through loops in Python. So first we look at what exactly loops are, then we look at the various varieties of loops, which are while loop, for loop, and nested loop. We'll also look at some of the loop control statements, and finally we'll wrap it up with an exercise on printing a certain pattern. So let's begin. So Jake here wants to print his name 10 times. Now there are two ways of doing this. One is he can literally give 10 print statements for printing his name, or he could use a smarter method and he could have just one print statement and somehow repeat the execution of this one statement. Now this is where loops come in. So a loop is basically an instruction that repeats multiple times as long as some condition is met. So Jake could simply use a loop to execute that one print statement 10 times. Now in Python, we have three main types of loops. There's the while loop, the for loop, and finally the nested loop. Now before we move into these loops, let's look at the flow of a loop. So the dot at the top represents the start of the program. Now all the statements of the program are executed one by one until a condition for the loop is encountered. Now if this condition results in true, the statements within the loop are executed and once again the condition is checked. Now this loop continues as long as the condition is satisfied. The minute the condition fails, the program's control exits out of the loop and all the statements following it are executed. So now that we got a basic idea of what loops are and how they run, let's look into our three basic loops. The first is the while loop. So the while loop is used to repeat a section of code an unknown number of times until a specific condition is met. So suppose Jake did not want his name to be printed exactly 10 times, but until the end of the page. In this case, you can use while loop and the condition would be print until end of page is reached. So what is the syntax of a while loop? You have the keyword while followed by the expression or the condition that is to be met and then colons. And following the colons on the very next line, you can start the statements which will exist within your while block indented slightly to the right. Now let's look at a short demo to better understand how while loop works. So I'll move into PyCharm. So we'll write a very simple program that asks the user to enter a multiple of 7. And the program keeps doing this until a multiple of 7 is correctly entered by the user. So if the user enters say 14 or 21, you simply print, yes, this is a multiple of 7. But on the other hand, if the user enters say 10 or 12 or any other number which is not a multiple of 7, you got to take the input again. So let's begin. First, I'll take an input from the user. And I'll store this in my variable val. So in Python, every input that you take from the user is automatically taken in the string format. And you need to convert this into int. So that is what this int function is for. And within the braces, you take the input. Now we need to make sure that the number entered by the user is a multiple of 7. And if it's not, we need to take the input again. So here's where the while loop comes in. We check the modulus of val against 7, and if this is not equal to 0, that means if val divided by 7 does not give a remainder, that means val is not a multiple of 7. So in this case, again we need to take the input from the user. So we'll repeat our first line once again. Let's have a look at the syntax for while before we move ahead. So we have the first keyword which is while, and then val mod 7 is not equal to 0 is a condition. Now every time this condition results in true, this statement is executed. So this is the only statement within the while loop. Now we need to also take care of the condition where the value is a multiple of 7. So this will come under else. Now, if you've gone through other programming languages, this might be something new you're coming across because else is always used with if You don't use it with while or for or any other loop statement as such. But in case of Python, this can be done. Else colon and next line print. So if the user did finally enter a multiple of 7, we'll just say that this number is a multiple of 7. So when you're printing the value of a variable within a sentence, this is how you do it. Wherever you want the value to appear in the sentence, place the placeholder, have the placeholder for the variable there. So in our case, val is an integer type of variable. Therefore, we have the placeholder %d. If val was a string type, we'd have %s. And after the quote, you put the modulus sign followed by your variable name. If you have 2 or more variables, after the modulus sign, within brackets, you can enter your variable names separated by commas, like this. So I just have one variable. And that's it. Now let's run this. Save it first. So your first line, enter a multiple of 7 is printed. Let's enter 18, which is not a multiple of 7, and see what happens. So once again, as we wanted, the input needs to be taken from the user, and this will continue until you do give a multiple of 7. So now if I give 14, there you go, 14 is a multiple of 7, and our program has successfully terminated. Now to better understand the flow of while loop, let's debug this program. So the first thing you do is you keep a breaking point on your first line, and then you go to run and debug the program. So in debugging, we basically see the execution line by line, and to do this, we press F8. So after your breaking point is placed, press F8, and the first line is printed in your console. So let's give in an input, say 87. Let's go back to our debugger. As you can see here, the value of val is now 87. And we have moved to the second line where val mod 7 was checked against 0. And because it was not 0, this means that the while's condition is true and you move into the statements within the while loop. So now we have reached the third line where we are taking the input from the user again. So once again we do F8, and as you see, the user input needs to be taken again. So now I'll give 42, which is a multiple of 7, enter, and it goes back to the while loop because now once again it needs to check if val mod 7 is not equal to 0. And as you can see here, now the value of val is 42. If we press F8, you'll notice how we jumped from line 2 to line 5. This is because this time 42 mod 7 was equal to 0. So the while resulted in false, and the statement right after false, which is your else, is what got executed. So now you have the execution for the last print statement. And if we press F8 once again, you see our program's terminated with the final output 42 is a multiple of 7. So I hope you understood while loop. Let's move on to the next loop, which is the for loop. Now for loop is used to iterate over a sequence. The sequence could be a list, it could be a tuple, it could be an array, a string, or it could even be a range. Basically, if you have certain elements arranged one after the other, a for loop can be used to iterate over these elements. So now let's look at the syntax of for loop. You have the for keyword followed by counter. So counter is basically a variable. Say you want to repeat your name 10 times. What you do is you always keep track of the number of times you've already repeated your names in your fingers. And that is exactly what a counter is to a for loop. A counter keeps track of the position that you're in the sequence. After counter, you have another keyword in, and then you have the sequence. So the sequence, you can literally give your list there, or you can have the variable which stores your list, tuple, array, or string. Now let's move into a demo for the for loop. Once again, I'll open my PyCharm. So now we'll write a program to iterate over a list. Now I'll store my list in the variable x, and my list will have the elements 1, 6, Simplilearn. Now using the for loop, I'll iterate over x. So my counter in this case will be I in and my sequence, which is x, always followed by the colon. And now I'll just print I. Let's save this and run it. So as you can see here, the elements of x are printed. There's 1, 6 followed by Simplilearn. So what it does is basically, when you give I in x, I assumes the value of the first element in x, prints this value, and every time you go back to the for loop, I is incremented by 1. So the second time you reach the for loop, I is now holding the value 6, and the third time I holds a value Simplilearn. Now the same thing can be done with just a string. So if x is equal to Simplilearn, which is a string, and we run this code now, you see all the letters of the string are printed one by one. So in case of strings, I holds the value of each character in the string right from the beginning up till the end. Now Python also allows nested loops, and by nested loops we mean loops within loops. So now there are various ways that nested loops could be implemented. It could be a for loop within a for loop. It could be a while within a while loop, a for within a while loop, or a while within a for loop. So in our demo for nested loops, we'll see one of the most popular applications for it, which is accessing the elements of a matrix. So first, we'll begin with creating a matrix. Store my matrix in variable x. And my matrix will have two lists. One would contain the elements 1, 2, 3, and the other will be of alphabets ABC. Now with the matrix, as you can see, there are two lists within it. Our first for loop will iterate over the elements of x. So the range is x. So when I say that I iterates over the elements of x, I basically takes the value of the first list in the first iteration and the second list in the second iteration. Now our second for loop, which is nested within our first for loop, will iterate over the values within that list. So for j in I, let me explain this once again. So if I points to your first list, j will be used to iterate over every element in your first list. And in your second iteration, I will point towards your second list and j will iterate over every element in your second list. We'll just print out the elements. And let's run this. I'll just increase the size of my console here. Run it. And as you can see, the elements of your matrix are printed. 1, 2, 3, ABC. Now what if you want 1, 2, 3 to be printed in one line and your next list elements, which are ABC, to be printed in the next line? So every time you print j, you do not want a next line. So put n equal to quotes. What this does is that it removes the new line, which is automatically put by the print function in Python. And once you exit the inner for loop, you're basically moving to the second list. So now you want a change in line. And hence I just put a print statement here. Let's run this. And as you see, 1, 2, 3, ABC. Now nested loops can get a little confusing with the flow. For this purpose, we'll also debug this code. Place your breaking point on the first line and debug. F8. And as you see, x holds the two lists 1, 2, 3, ABC. Now F8 again, and our first for loop is executed and I now holds the value 1, 2, 3. As you can see here, we now have moved into a second for loop and j holds the value 1. So I right now points to our first list in x and j points to the first element in our first list in x. Now once we execute the print statement, your first element gets printed. And once the first element is printed, you go back to your inner for loop. And now 2 gets printed. Once again, you go back to your inner for loop. 3 is printed. and again you go back to your inner for loop. Now you have reached the end of the ith list. The next time you click the F8, you're basically jumping over to the print statement at the end, which shifts to a new line. And now we are back to our outside for loop. So our outer for loops counter, which is I, now points to the second list in X, which is ABC. So when we are back, so we click F8 again, and J has taken the value of the first element in your second list, which is A. Once again F8, and as you can see, A is printed in the console below. We are back to our inner for loop, print, press F8 again, B gets printed. Again we are back to our inner for loop and C gets printed. Now we have reached the end of our second list too. So the next time we press F8, the control skips to the last print statement, which is a new line statement, and it goes back to the outer for loop. Now here too, the counter I has reached the end of our matrix X. So once again, when we hit the F8, our program terminates. Now as we saw, loops have a certain flow, and you might come across certain scenarios where you want to break out of this flow. So this is where the loop control statement comes in. We look at the two most popular loop control statements used in Python. The first is the break keyword. Suppose you're executing a loop for say 10 times, but if a certain condition occurs between our first and our 10th iteration, we want to immediately exit out of the loop. In this case, you can use the break statement. So I'll just move back to my PyCharm and show you a simple demo on how break can be used. So the first thing we do is we'll create a string. I'll store this in my variable X. Now to iterate through the string, of course we'll use the for loop for I in X and colon. Now what we want our program to do is that it should print only the first sentence of our string. So it should print just hey there. And as we can see in our string here, hey there is followed by a full stop. So we can say that whenever we encounter the full stop, we'll break out of the loop and print no more. So if I is equal to full stop, we'll break out of the loop. And for every other case, we'll simply print I, which is the character in our string. So let's run this code. And as you can see here, all our characters, hey, there, are printed. And once I is equal to full stop, the if statement results in true. And we encounter the break statement, which breaks the loop. So as you can see here, every character of our string is printed in a new line, which is not what we want. So in our print statement, put end equal to quotes. And this will ensure that you're not going to a new line every time. Let's run break again. And yeah, hey there appears in the single line. So once again, I'll repeat how the flow of this program works. Goes to the for loop. I iterates over every character in the string, hey there, how are you? And every time, I is checked against a full stop. So if I is not equal to the full stop, we come to this print statement, which is a part of our outer for loop, and only the character is printed. We go back to our for loop every time, and I is incremented, so it keeps pointing to the next character. And once I is equal to full stop, we encounter the break statement, which breaks the control to outside the loop, and our program terminates successfully. Now we'll have a look at our second loop control statement, which is continue. So in some cases, when a certain condition occurs within a loop, you do not want to break out of the loop, but you want to skip that particular iteration for the loop. So in this case, you can use continue. Once again, we'll move back to PyCharm so I can show you a short demo on how continue works. Now for our demo for the continue keyword, we want to print all the numbers in a list which are less than 10. So to iterate through a list, we have for I in and our list, which is 1, 13, 56, 4, 6. Now let's see how we write this program without using the continue statement first. So within the for loop, if I is greater than 10, which is basically the number we do not want to print, we have no action to give under if. because there's nothing we want to do if the number is greater than 10. And under else, which is if the number is not greater than 10, we'd want to print it. Now this seems simple, but the problem here is that you cannot leave if without any action. This would result in an error. As you can see here, there's an indent expected, and this is where continue comes in. So if I is greater than 10, you continue. So basically you skip all statements after this continue statement in the for loop. And when you insert your continue statement, the control automatically goes back to the for loop. So in that case, you do not even require your else statement here. And you can just have print under your for loop. So once again, I'll explain how this works. I iterates over our list. So I points to our elements 1, 13, 56, 4 and 6 in each iteration respectively. And every time we check if I is greater than 10. If I is greater than 10, we do not want to print I. We just say continue, so the control goes back to the for loop. And if I is not greater than 10, that is if I is any number between 0 to 9, we simply come here and the number is printed. So I'll save this and let's run this code. So as you can see here, 1 gets printed, 4 and 6 is printed. We can debug this too, just to see how the flow works. So place your breakpoint here and debug continue. As you can see, first time I is pointed to 1. Now I is checked if it's greater than 10. Of course, I is not greater than 10. So the control skips to the print statement. And if you go back to the console, press F8, you can see 1 gets printed. Now the control goes back to the for loop and this time I is 13. Is 13 greater than 10? Yes, 13 is greater than 10. So the if condition is satisfied and we reach the continue statement. So once the continue is executed, as you can see here, the control transfers back to for loop and I moves on to the next iteration. And I currently holds the value of 56. So this way, all your numbers which are less than 10 gets printed one by one. Now that we have gone through some of the basic concepts of loops, let's get into the exercise. So here we want to print a pattern of an inverted triangle using asterisks. Now our program should take the number of rows from the user and based on that number, it should print this pattern. For example, if the user enters 4, our pattern should have 4 rows. And if the user enters 3, our pattern should have 3 rows. So let's move to PyCharm and begin writing our code. The first thing to do is we need to take the input for the number of rows from the user. So I'll store the input in my variable x. Now we need to figure out how from the number of rows we can find out the number of asterisks that need to be there on the first line of our pattern. So let's go back to our pattern. As you can see here, if you need to print a pattern of 4 rows, our first row would have 7 asterisks, our second row would have 5 asterisks, our third row would have 3 asterisks, and our last row, which is the fourth row, would have 1 asterisk. So at every row, 1 asterisk from either side is removed, and instead of that, a space is added. So in the second row, we have a space in the beginning followed by 5 asterisks and then a space again. And in the similar manner, in our third row, we have 2 spaces in the beginning followed by 3 asterisks and 2 spaces again. But how do we know how many asterisks to begin with? So if our number of rows is 4, we begin with 7 asterisks. That is 4 2 times, which is 8 minus 1. In the similar way, if we have 3 rows, then our first row would contain 5 asterisks, which is 3 2 times, that is 6 minus 1. And if you draw this pattern similarly for any number, you'd notice that for every number, the first row would contain the number of rows into 2 minus 1 asterisks. So if we go back to our code, we know now that our formula is 2x minus 1 for the number of asterisks in our first row. So let me name this as y, and y holds the value 2x minus 1. Now let's store the value of y in another variable, say n, This is because while y's value will remain constant, we'll require n to manipulate the value throughout our program. So n will basically signify the number of asterisks in each row. So if we just look at our first row, all the n asterisks need to be printed. So say for I in range of 1 to n plus 1, print your asterisks. So the range function basically takes all the numbers from 1 to the end limit, except that it excludes the end limit. So if I would write here 1 comma n, then all the numbers from 1 to n minus 1 would only be taken. Since I want n asterisks and not n minus 1 asterisks, my end limit would be n plus 1. Now this takes care of the asterisks. But what about the spaces before and after the asterisks? So let's go back to our pattern. And as you see here, if you consider the spaces, all the rows have equal number of characters. That is, in case of our first example, the first row has 7 characters or 7 asterisks. The second row has 5 asterisks and 2 spaces on either side. So that's basically 7 characters again. So the number of spaces is the number of asterisks in that particular row minus the number of asterisks in the first row. So in our first row, obviously we have no spaces. In our second row, we would have 5 minus 7 spaces. That is 2 spaces. Therefore, the formula for finding the number of spaces would be the number of rows minus the number of asterisks in that particular row. So in terms of our variables, the formula would be y minus n. And let me store this in a variable space. But here's the thing. The entire y minus n spaces are not put together. They're divided into 2 parts. Y minus n by 2 spaces come before the asterisks and y minus n by 2 spaces come after the asterisks. So the value of our space variable would be y minus n divided by 2. Now I'm putting 2 slashes here because 1 slash, although divides, gives you the floating point number. When you insert 2 slashes, it gives you the integer value. So now before our asterisks, we'll print space number of spaces, and after our asterisks are printed, we'll again print space number of spaces. So for j in range of 1 comma space plus 1, print a space and exclude the new line. And after the asterisks are printed, again print your spaces. So for k in range 1 comma space plus 1, print a space. So this takes care of each row being asterisks followed by spaces. Now this would only print one row. We want this to be repeated x number of times. Another way we can put this is that we want the rows to be printed until we reach a row with a single asterisk. And as we mentioned earlier, n holds the number of asterisks in each row. So using while loop, we can say that we want the following statements to be printed as long as n is greater than or equal to 1. We'll indent everything within our while loop. So that looks complete. But here's the thing, where are you changing the value of n? So every time, as we mentioned earlier when we were going through the pattern, the number of asterisks in each row reduces by 2. So after you print an entire row, reduce the value of n by 2. So that looks right. Now let's run this code. Enter the number of rows. I'll say 4. Okay, something's off here. All the asterisks are printed in a single line, which is not what we want. Why is this so? So if you go back to your code, you'll notice that we have terminated each print statement with the end parameter, which means that it skips going to the next line. But at the end of every row that we print, we do want to go to the next line. So in our while loop, at the end of printing the rows, let's add a print statement. Save this and run it again. Again, there's something wrong with our pattern. Although the number of asterisks are correct, the spacing seems off. If you notice closely, the number of spaces is always maintained constant. There are equal number of spaces on this side for every row. This is because the formula to assign the value for the number of spaces is outside our while loop. This should be inside our while loop because the value of n keeps changing in every iteration. So let's move this into the while loop. Run our program again. And there you go. Our pattern is printed. Let's try it again with another number, say 11. So our program can print this pattern for any number. And with that, we come to an end of our Python tutorial on loops. If you have any doubts regarding this, please post them in the comment section below and we'll definitely get back to you. If you like this video, please hit the like button. Also subscribe to our channel if you have not yet. See you all next time.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.